I needed fast cash, so I married a ghost bride. I was a typical college student, struggling to make ends meet and trying to stay afloat in a sea of student loan debt. My parents had immigrated to the United States from China when I was a child, and like many first-generation immigrants, they had sacrificed so much to give me the opportunity to go to college. But even with their support, I still found myself struggling to keep up with the high cost of tuition and living expenses. I had to work multiple part-time jobs just to get by, and even then, it was a struggle. I tried to remind myself every day of how hard my parents worked. My mother juggling 2 housekeeping jobs, while my father spent long hours as a line cook, just to give me a chance at a better future. I hated feeling like I was letting them down, but I sometimes wondered if I was close to breaking under all the pressure. But then, one day a friend of mine came to me with a proposition. She told me that her aunt was a traditional Chinese matchmaker, and she had a client who was looking for someone to marry a ghost bride. I had heard of the concept before. It was an old tradition where, when a woman died before getting married, her family would find a man to marry her in death, lifting the shame of being husbandless for eternity. It was a bizarre, almost superstitious idea, and I initially said no, thinking it was silly and that my parents wouldn't be happy about it. Deep down, I also felt a flicker of anxiety at the thought of messing around with the dead, even though I told myself I didn't believe in ghosts. "Jin, please, just hear her out," my friend pleaded. "She's offering a lot of money. It could really help you out with your tuition and bills." I was torn. The idea of marrying a ghost seemed absurd, but I desperately needed the money. I agreed to meet with the matchmaker. She was an elderly woman with a kind face and a gentle demeanor. She wore a red silk qipao, a traditional Chinese dress, her graying hair pulled back into a neat bun. She greeted me with a warm smile and gestured for me to sit down. "I'm glad you've decided to consider my proposal," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "I understand that this may seem strange to you, but it is an ancient tradition that has been passed down for generations. It is a way to honor the spirit of the deceased and bring peace to her family." I nodded, still feeling a bit skeptical. "I'm just not sure if I'm comfortable with the idea of marrying a ghost," I admitted, though I couldn't deny I was also thinking about how much I could use the cash. The matchmaker nodded sympathetically, folding her hands on the desk. "I understand your hesitation. It can be a difficult concept to wrap your head around, but let me assure you, this is not a real marriage. It is simply a symbolic gesture to honor the deceased and lift the burden of shame from her family. You are not expected to have any physical or emotional connection to the ghost bride." She reached into her desk and pulled out a check, sliding it across the table towards me. I gasped when I saw the amount. It was more than enough to cover all my tuition and living expenses for the rest of the year, and maybe even throw something toward paying back part of my parents' sacrifice. "In return for your help, you will receive this generous sum as a token of appreciation for your role in this tradition," the matchmaker said, with a twinkle in her eye. "It is a small price to pay for the opportunity to bring peace and honor to the spirit of the deceased." I stared at the check, my mind racing. The matchmaker's words were persuasive. I kept telling myself I didn't really believe in ghosts, and it sounded like a quick, easy way to earn much-needed money. After a few moments of hesitation, I decided to accept the proposal right there. I'd figure out how to rationalize it later. The day of the ceremony arrived sooner than I expected. As I stood at the altar, surrounded by the heavy smell of incense and the rhythmic sound of chanting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The wedding ceremony was taking place in a small, dimly lit temple, its walls lined with photographs of ancestors. It felt like every portrait was staring at me, with an unspoken question of whether I truly understood what I was about to do. The bride's family was in attendance, huddled together in the front row. They were a wealthy, traditional Chinese family, and I could tell they weren't thrilled about the idea of their daughter being married off to a stranger. But they had agreed to the arrangement in order to free their daughter from the shame of dying unmarried, and they went through with the ceremony with grim determination. I could almost feel their judgment pressing down on me, but I tried to steel myself by thinking of the check I'd be leaving with. The priest was an old, wizened man who looked like he'd seen a thing or two in his time. He officiated with a mixture of reverence and skepticism. The matchmaker stood off to the side, seeming at ease, as though everything was perfectly normal. Meanwhile, I stood there like someone about to make a huge, irreversible mistake. The ghost bride was represented by an effigy made of bamboo, dressed in real clothing and fake jewelry. I stood at the altar, repeating the vows as I was instructed, feeling the strangest knot in my stomach. The priest placed the bride's ancestral tablet inside the effigy to animate her spirit. As the ceremony ended, the effigy was fed a wedding feast, a symbolic last meal, and then it was burned, the flames sending it to the spirit world. Over the next few days, I felt oddly relieved, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders simply because I now had enough money to cover tuition. I slept better, and I convinced myself that I'd done nothing truly wrong. But the calm didn't last. One morning, I woke up to find that some objects in my room weren't in the same place I remembered leaving them. At first, I brushed it off, but as the days passed, the feeling of unease grew. It was as though a presence lingered in the corners of my room, just out of sight. Then came the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of a bride dressed in red, her face just a blur of shifting shadows. She was translucent, more like moving fog than a solid figure. Yet she felt horribly real. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart hammering. The frequency of these nightmares increased until it reached a point where I dreaded going to sleep, terrified I'd see her again. I'd always been a skeptic about ghosts and the supernatural, dismissing them as flights of fancy or figments of overactive imaginations. But the more I dreamed about the bride, the more I started to wonder if there was some truth behind this. The nightmares grew so intense that I became convinced this wasn't just random guilt or anxiety. Her presence in my dreams became threatening, her translucent figure looming over me, sometimes whispering words I couldn't quite decipher. When I woke in a cold sweat, I could still feel the echo of her voice in the dark silence of my room. My exhaustion mounted. I tried to stay awake as long as I could, gulping down coffees and energy drinks, but I still had to go to classes and my part-time jobs. My grades started to slip, and I snapped at friends for no reason. I'd even begun lashing out at people I cared about, frustrated that I couldn't find a solution to the nightmares that plagued me. I felt guilty for being so on edge, but I couldn't help it. The constant barrage of ghostly visions was wearing down my nerves to the point where I nearly flinched at every small sound. I tried to do something about it. I reached out to a local spiritualist who claimed she could exorcise malevolent spirits. When I visited her cramped little office, she listened to my story, arching an eyebrow with a look that mingled doubt and apprehension. She told me quietly that this was beyond her abilities, that once ancestors were involved and a traditional vow had been made, it wasn't a simple matter of banishing a ghost with an incantation. She suggested I might need to find a traditional Taoist priest or consult the family again. That was the last thing I wanted. I didn't want to contact the bride's family or let them know how miserable I was. I feared they would blame me, or worse, demand some arcane ritual I couldn't afford or wouldn't comprehend. So I looked elsewhere for solutions. I hunted down old books and articles about ghost marriages, hoping for some clue on how to break whatever tethered the bride's spirit to me. But most of what I found just confirmed the superstition and tradition behind it. None gave me a clean, easy way out. The ghost bride's appearances shifted from just my dreams to something more tangible. I'd be in my apartment, and a cold breeze would sweep through the room even though the windows were closed. My desk chair would be a foot away from where I left it. My textbooks opened to pages I hadn't touched. Sometimes, I heard faint whispers in the night. They were muffled, like distant moans drifting through a heavy fog. But they seemed to say my name, blaming me, haunting me. No matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, I kept feeling the creeping dread of knowing I might have brought all of this on myself. Late one night, as I was on the edge of sleep, I felt a bone-chilling cold rush through the room. My eyes snapped open and I saw her. She stood at the foot of my bed, the ghost bride. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes stared at me with hollow intensity, as if probing the depths of my soul. Her red wedding dress was ragged, hanging off her like a frayed veil of ancient lace, and the details of her figure flickered in and out of solidity. She whispered, "You should have never married me. You don't belong to me. You never will." I wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed, every muscle locked by sheer terror. And then, just as swiftly as she had appeared, she vanished. I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, my throat raw from a silent scream. I curled up on my bed, trembling so hard that my teeth chattered. That was the turning point. I realized this was a battle for my sanity. I either had to find some way to break this haunting or accept that I'd be swallowed up by it. Desperate, I kept searching, asking friends in hushed tones if they knew any reliable mediums or old traditions that might help. Most of them shrugged me off. One friend gave me an old, dusty tome she'd found in an antique bookstore, a compendium of Chinese rituals. That was how I discovered that many such ceremonies were never meant to banish a spirit outright, but to appease it. So maybe, I thought, I was going about this the wrong way. Instead of fighting the ghost bride or trying to cast her out, I might need to satisfy her. Over the course of several days, I researched her family background, gleaning tidbits about her life and their customs, though I still couldn't bring myself to ask the matchmaker or her relatives directly. I learned that traditional offerings, food, incense, prayers, were often used to show respect. Maybe if I showed the bride that I recognized her, respected her as an ancestor of sorts, she would leave me alone. I set up a small altar in my apartment, placing a photograph of the ghost bride, which I'd managed to copy from a picture at the ceremony, in the center. I lit incense, offered her pineapples and mangoes, and recited awkward prayers I'd found in old texts. At first, the entire thing felt absurd, but each night I would bow and respectfully call her by the name I'd found on the edges of the family records. I tried to communicate that I was sorry for any disrespect, that I only took part in the wedding because of my desperation for money, and that I wanted to ease her suffering. In the following nights, her terrifying visits grew less frequent. Though I still sometimes woke up sweating, it wasn't every night. The sense of an angry presence looming around my room began to fade, replaced by something more subdued, almost watchful. I felt like I had reached a fragile truce. This eerie calm let me focus a little more on school and on trying to reclaim a semblance of normal life, though I had to maintain that altar nightly. If I forgot even once, I swore I felt a cold breeze or saw a flicker of red in the corner of my vision. During this time, I met someone new. Her name was Mia, and we clicked immediately. She had beautiful brown eyes, a brilliant mind, and a wicked sense of humor that drew me to her like a magnet. We bonded over our shared fascination with folklore and cultural traditions, which was how we first started talking in a college seminar about Eastern mythology. For the first time in months, I felt something close to happiness whenever I was with her. But I couldn't bring myself to tell Mia about the ghost bride. I didn't want her to think I was insane or superstitious. I certainly didn't want to explain that I'd once stood in a temple, marrying a dead woman for money. The mere thought of telling Mia the truth sent an uncomfortable jolt of shame through me. I started making excuses to keep her out of my apartment. I told her my roommate was messy, or that I was embarrassed about the state of the place. She laughed it off, but I could sense her curiosity growing. I felt terrible for lying to her, but I felt I had no choice. Still, my relationship with Mia blossomed. We spent late nights at cafes, discussing everything from modern politics to ancient dynasties. We'd watch goofy movies or stroll around campus, sharing our hopes for the future. Her dream was to become an art historian specializing in Eastern calligraphy, while I just wanted to make it through college in one piece and maybe pay off my debts. During those moments, life felt almost normal. Eventually, the ghost bride's appearances dwindled. Days turned into weeks without incident. I was naive enough to start thinking that perhaps I'd managed to appease her for good, but that sense of relief was short-lived. Strange things started happening again. At first, I noticed small objects missing. My keys, a few books, even the photograph of the ghost bride from my altar. I'd find them later in odd places around my apartment, like the back of my closet or inside a kitchen cabinet I barely used. I tried to brush it off, but a nagging fear crawled back into my mind. Then, in the middle of the night, she came back. I felt a cold wind rustle through the darkness, and when I opened my eyes, there she was at the foot of my bed, her torn red dress fluttering in an unseen breeze. I swore I could see her skeletal fingers curled at her side, and her eyes, those hazel eyes, fixed on me with a fury I hadn't seen before. "You thought you could escape me," she whispered. "But you were wrong. You will never be free of me." There was a new dimension to her voice. Bitterness, jealousy. I realized in a flash of panic that she must know about Mia. She went on in a voice like distant thunder, telling me I had no right to be with another woman. My heart pounded so fiercely it ached. I'd never wanted to be married to this spirit, but the ceremony was clearly more binding than I ever understood. I'd had enough. I resolved that I needed to run. I couldn't keep living like this, juggling fear and lies. I decided, for the sake of my own sanity, to leave everything behind: school, the apartment, the part-time jobs, and start over somewhere else. More importantly, I needed to come clean to Mia. Maybe she'd leave me once I told her the truth, or maybe she'd think I was insane. I couldn't lie to her any longer. One evening, as we sat together in my battered old car, parked near her place, I finally told her. I started with a shaky voice, explaining how I'd needed money and accepted the matchmaker's proposal, how I never believed in ghosts until my life became a living nightmare. Mia was horrified, but she didn't pull away. She listened, eyes wide with a mixture of compassion and fear. When I finished, I felt tears burning in my eyes, convinced she'd want nothing more to do with me. "Jin," she said softly, taking my hand in hers. That's a lot to take in, but I don't want you to go through this alone. I'm here. We'll figure it out." I almost broke down in relief. I told her my plan. "Let's leave town together. Let's pack our things and just drive. Find some place where the ghost bride can't follow." Surprisingly, Mia agreed. She'd been unhappy where she was too, feeling stuck and longing for a fresh start. And so we started packing. We sold off some belongings, stuffed clothes into a couple of suitcases, and decided to set off at night to avoid dealing with traffic or too many questions. She told her parents she was going to travel with a friend for a while. I told my parents I'd found a job somewhere else. Neither of us mentioned the haunting, of course. As we drove into the darkness, I felt a rush of exhilaration. Mia sat beside me, occasionally feeding me slices of fresh fruit to keep me awake at the wheel. The warm glow of passing headlights cast fleeting patterns over her face, and I felt hope welling up in me, thinking that maybe I'd finally left the nightmares behind. But then, out of nowhere, My phone rang. It was past midnight, and the caller ID showed an unknown number. When I picked it up, a serious voice identified himself as a police officer. He said there had been a break-in at Mia's house and that they'd found a body. My blood ran cold, and I couldn't wrap my head around the question, whose body was it? The officer told me I needed to come to the station to identify it, and that a neighbor had given them my phone number. I was in shock, staring at Mia as though she might have an answer, but something in her expression made my chest tight. Her eyes seemed to shift from soft brown to a colder, almost hazel hue under the reflection of the car's interior lights. She put down her bag of pineapple slices, reached over, and calmly took my phone from my hands, then turned it off. Then she looked at me and smiled in a way that froze my insides. At that moment, a horrible suspicion twisted in my gut. Her voice came out calmer than I ever heard it. "We're not going to any station tonight. We have someplace else to be." A chill spread through my arms as I recognized an echo of another voice in her tone. I glanced at the seat behind her, half expecting to see the translucent figure of the ghost bride. My mind raced, struggling to piece together what was happening. Was it possible that the ghost bride had found her way into Mia? Or was this simply the effect of fear and stress? I asked Mia to give me back my phone, but she shook her head, keeping it well out of my reach. She said something like, "It's too late to turn back," in a voice that was eerily detached, and I felt a strange panic welling up in me. If it weren't for the fact that I knew Mia so well, I might have tried to tell myself she was just panicking. But her expression, the color of her eyes, the dispassionate smile, none of that belonged to the woman I cared about. "Mia," I asked quietly, my mouth going dry, "are you okay?" She kept driving, taking an exit off the highway that led us onto a narrower, darker road. A moment later, I realized we were heading toward a remote area thick with trees. My heart hammered. I tried the door handle, but she'd locked it. The silent beep told me the child lock was engaged. I forced myself not to panic, but the sense of dread and helplessness felt overwhelming. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "Don't you understand? You belong to me." It wasn't Mia's voice that spoke. It was that same quiet, resonant voice I'd heard at the foot of my bed. I felt my stomach drop as I realized the ghost bride must have possessed Mia somehow, latching onto her body out of jealousy, or out of some twisted desire to claim what she believed was hers. I remembered the police call. A break-in, a body discovered, and the need for identification. My mind reeled. Who would be in Mia's house? Was it possible that the real Mia had never left the house? And that the spirit possessed some kind of double in front of me? I had no idea. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up horrifying scenarios. But one thing was clear. The presence next to me was not fully Mia. We drove for what felt like an eternity, down a deserted road flanked by towering pines and a thick undergrowth that swallowed all but our headlights. She eventually pulled over, and before I could react, she turned off the engine. The night around us was silent, except for the faint sound of insects and the low whisper of wind. My hands shook as I tried to think of a plan. The locks stayed engaged. She turned to me, her face lit faintly by the glow of the car's overhead lamp. Her eyes, those eyes, were half-lidded, hazel with an otherworldly sheen, the expression of someone who was present and absent at the same time. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak calmly. "What do you want from me? You said I shouldn't have married you. You said I never belonged to you. Why are you doing this?" A faint smile tugged at her lips, and she tilted her head. "You tried to get rid of me," she said, her voice catching somewhere between Mia's and the ghost bride's. "You thought running away with this woman would fix everything. But you can't escape a vow made before the ancestors." I remembered how I'd repeated vows in that dimly lit temple, how I'd watched that bamboo effigy burn. I'd thought it was all symbolic, no more than going through the motions for money. But apparently, the vow had tethered me to her in ways I never anticipated. I tried a different angle. "Let Mia go," I said. "This isn't her fight. If you have a problem with me, take it out on me." A flicker of sadness passed across Mia's face. "You promised," the ghost bride said, softening for a moment. "You vowed, and then you tried to abandon me." Her hand trembled, as though she was wrestling with her own emotions. "I don't know what to do. I can't cross over, not like this." I realized that was what she truly wanted. A proper resolution. All along, the ghost bride had been trapped in a loop of anger and grief, never properly laid to rest. The minimal offerings and rituals I had done on my own weren't enough to quell her rage, especially when she believed I was discarding her for a living partner. The idea horrified me, but I saw no choice. If I ever wanted my life back, and if I wanted Mia safe, I had to make things right for the ghost bride. I spoke slowly, measuring each word. "Let Mia go," I repeated. "I will see that you find peace. I'll make sure your family does whatever is needed so you can rest with your ancestors. But you have to let her go." I could see her conflict in the half of Mia's expression that still belonged to the spirit. Outside, Wind rustled through the trees. The car smelled faintly of fruit and fear. For a heartbeat, she seemed to waver. Then Mia's eyes rolled back and she slumped forward against the steering wheel, letting out a low moan. I panicked, grabbing her shoulders, calling her name. Her hair brushed against my face, and when she finally lifted her head, her eyes were back to being a soft brown. She was shaking, disoriented. We sat there for a few moments, hugging each other in the silent darkness. Mia said she felt so cold, like a shadow had run its fingers down her spine. I explained as best I could that the ghost bride was inside her, but might have retreated for now. We both knew we couldn't keep running, not unless we wanted this to happen again and again. So we drove back to town. Mia let me take the wheel, and decided to seek out the matchmaker immediately, no matter the hour. We pulled up to the matchmaker's old-fashioned shop while the sky was still dark, well past midnight. The windows were dark, but I banged on the wooden door until a light finally flickered on upstairs. The matchmaker, now in a robe and her hair undone, opened the door with a scowl, only to look alarmed when she recognized me. We told her everything in hushed, frantic voices. She rubbed her forehead and confessed that maybe the ceremony they performed had been rushed, more concerned with the ritual's outward appearance than the spirit's true peace. The bride's family, she added, might bear responsibility as well, but it fell on me to face them if I wanted a proper release from the vow. I felt a surge of dread, but also relief that there was a potential path forward. Mia sat quietly, trembling slightly as she recalled that moment of possession. We all agreed that a second, more thorough ceremony was needed, one in which I would openly acknowledge the bride before her ancestors and release her in earnest. The matchmaker promised to reach out to the family first thing in the morning. We were told to rest in a spare room above the shop until then, because even the matchmaker didn't want me wandering off with the ghost bride still potentially so close at hand. The next day, I found myself standing on the bride's family's doorstep, the same place where I'd once been ushered in for the bizarre wedding arrangement. The father answered. He looked stunned to see me again, but I bowed deeply and told him everything, in front of the matchmaker and Mia. At first, he was furious, thinking I was accusing his daughter of tormenting me. Slowly, though, the matchmaker intervened, explaining that a second, more profound ritual might be the only way to bring her spirit peace. The father's anger gave way to sorrow. He said he'd lost a piece of himself when his daughter died, and the ghost marriage had been an act of desperation. Now he saw it had backfired horribly, chaining both his daughter and me to a painful limbo. That evening, we gathered in the family's ancestral hall, a smaller room lit by candles and incense. There were old portraits of relatives who had passed, some going back generations. The father set up a new ancestral tablet for his daughter, explaining that this was meant to welcome her into their lineage in the afterlife, a proper recognition so she could rest. I stood there, swallowing my nerves, aware that Mia was close by, trying to remain calm. The matchmaker oversaw the proceedings, whispering instructions to me on how to recite the prayers. A hush fell over the room as we prepared to begin. I lit several sticks of incense, my hands shaking. I placed them in a brass urn that stood before the bride's photograph, which had been placed beside other family ancestors. My voice quavered as I repeated the prayers, that I honored her memory, that I acknowledged the vow I had ignorantly made, and that I now asked the ancestors to let her pass on in peace, releasing her from any earthly ties. The father burned paper offerings meant to provide the bride with comfort in the spirit world. I bowed deeply, tears prickling my eyes, thinking of how selfish and naive I had been. For a moment, I felt a presence behind me, colder than the night air, but somehow less threatening than before. I remembered the ghost bride's face as I'd seen her so many times in my nightmares, but it was softer in my mind now, less twisted by anger and regret. It was as though, in this final, sincere gesture, she was able to receive the respect and closure that had been missing. I felt a deep pang of guilt for not doing this right from the start. If I had known how strongly these traditions mattered, how real they might be, maybe neither of us would have suffered so long. When the final paper offering curled into ash, a hush settled over the room. The father quietly set the bride's new tablet among the others, so that she would be among loved ones even in death. I glanced at Mia, whose eyes were wet with tears. She gave me a small, encouraging nod. The matchmaker exhaled heavily as though she too had been holding her breath. A sense of calm, fragile but real, seeped into the air. In the days after that second ceremony, Mia and I stayed in town to see if the ghost bride would appear again. She did not. My apartment felt different, lighter. I no longer felt the prickling sensation of being watched, and my nightmares disappeared. Mia still sometimes woke in the middle of the night, trembling with memories of that possession, but I would hold her until she felt safe enough to fall asleep again. We realized it would take time for both of us to fully heal from this ordeal, but we were moving forward. One afternoon, I received a call from the bride's father. He said quietly that he had placed an altar for his daughter in their ancestral hall, and that they'd performed even more prayers on her behalf. He told me that he hoped we could all put this behind us now. And though I didn't expect an apology, he did say, "I'm sorry we brought you into this." I told him I was sorry too, for my ignorance and for any disrespect I'd shown. We ended the call without animosity, something I never thought possible. Mia and I decided to continue our plan of leaving town for a fresh start. But now, it felt less like running away and more like moving on. The ghost bride was laid to rest properly, freed from an unwanted marriage that had tormented both of us. I finally felt like I wasn't dragging around a chain of guilt and fear. We loaded our car, this time in broad daylight, and drove off with genuine hope rather than frantic desperation. We passed the old temple on the way out, and I thought about that flickering orange glow of the funeral pyre, the chanting, the vow I had once repeated blindly. I whispered a quiet goodbye, wishing her spirit well in the afterlife. We drove for hours, stopping only for gas and the occasional meal. Mia sat beside me, munching fruit slices again. But this time we smiled at each other whenever our eyes met. I could still remember the horror of that final confrontation, how her voice had been stolen by something that was never meant to inhabit her. Now, she was just Mia again, free and safe. We even laughed about small things, like that time we first met in class, or the bizarre stories of campus myths. Everything felt different, in a good way. A few weeks later, as we settled into a modest apartment in a new city, I reflected on everything that had happened. I felt a profound gratitude to be free of the ghost bride. The nightmares no longer stalked me, and the hush of my bedroom at night was just that. Quiet, restful silence. Mia and I began exploring our new surroundings, talking about the future, about finishing our degrees, about what paths life might take us on. We were cautious, but optimistic. On some nights, though, as I sat alone and thought about the past, I felt a subtle chill in the air. I wondered if somewhere, in the afterlife, she looked in on me. Maybe there was a piece of her that wanted to see how I fared after everything. When these thoughts came, I did nothing elaborate. I would just murmur a short prayer, offering her whatever peace I could in that moment, and the chill would fade, as though she was gently turning away, back to her ancestral realm. Life continued. There were still bills to pay, classes to attend, stress about the future, but I carried this experience in my heart, determined to never again take such a tradition lightly or treat it like a hollow transaction. I had learned that some vows run deeper than we can see, that the spirit world, whether you believe in it literally or see it as a reflection of our guilt and responsibility, can press in on our everyday reality in ways that change us forever. I would never be the same person I was before the ceremony, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe I'd grown more empathetic, more appreciative of life, and more careful about how my actions affect others, even those who no longer walk among us. And that was how my tale ended, or perhaps how it began anew. I was no longer just a struggling college student taking desperate measures for money. I was someone who had married a ghost bride out of necessity, lived through nights of horror, faced the burden of ancient traditions, and ultimately found a way to lay the spirit to rest. I still felt pangs of remorse for the pain I'd caused, but gratitude that I was allowed a second chance to make it right. I only hoped that she, wherever she was, had found the peace that had eluded her in life, and that maybe she too was free to move on.